From security breaches and data misuse to so-called dark patterns and beyond, people are increasingly questioning the impact that technologies are having on our society and calling for organizations to be more accountable for their actions. This matters as technology plays an increasingly prominent role in our lives and our world becomes more data-driven. It has arguably never been more important to be able to monitor, oversee, and challenge the actions of organizations. In our paper, we demonstrate that information disclosures, that is, transparency mechanisms that should support organizational accountability, appear to be ineffective in doing so. We argue that better is possible, exploring how disclosures might be made more effective if they were to directly cater for the needs of the recipients. Information disclosures are where organizations provide particular information to an interested stakeholder. They're a core part of many laws and regulations in which accountability is important, and a feature in general regulations as well as those sector-specific, such as in finance and health. Our focus here is on data protection. Data protection concerns how personal information about ourselves is collected, used, and shared. In many data protection regulations, people will have certain rights to request their information from an organization. For example, under the EU's General Data Protection Regulation, or GDPR, people have the right of access, allowing them to go to an organization and ask them to provide the personal data that that organization holds on them and information about how that data is being used and shared. In many cases, that organization is then legally obliged to comply with this request and to disclose that information to you. This right represents one transparency mechanism of the GDPR. Information disclosures are seen as one way of increasing organizational transparency. In instances where you feel that an organization may be behaving in ways that you object to, or even if you're just curious, you have the ability to request information from organizations about what data they have on you and what they're doing with it. In this way, disclosures allow you to monitor, oversee, and investigate, and support you in taking further action where appropriate. For example, you might contest the information they hold, challenge the data processing practices, or seek restitution. Such disclosures can give general insights into the nature of the organization and its practices, all of which are important for holding an organization to account. It follows that effective transparency mechanisms are a way to empower individuals, giving them a means to oversee the practices of organizations that concern them and to push back against those practices if and when required. That is, disclosures represent a transparency mechanism that helps support accountability. Importantly, however, transparency isn't the aim or end goal itself. Simply disclosing information doesn't necessarily help in supporting accountability. In fact, providing too much information can even hinder understanding of what is happening, perhaps through obscuring useful material within other information. It follows that for a disclosure to be effective, it is important that the recipient is able to effectively engage with and understand the information being disclosed to them. And in practice, disclosures are typically highly technical in nature, often providing detailed data without context or supporting materials, and are of limited use to all but the most technical individuals. These were actual disclosures that were gathered by us as part of this research. As you can see, they're fairly technical, where data is fragmented across different files, lacking in context or metadata to help interpret, and they're arguably not particularly insightful about how the organization will process your personal data. This appears to be fairly consistent with what others in the literature have observed. We argue that these types of disclosures do not appear to be effective in communicating information to your average person. This makes it challenging for individuals to understand, oversee, and challenge the practices of technology firms, or to hold them to account. We argue that better disclosures are not only possible, but crucial for effectively supporting accountability over data-driven organizations. Towards this, we make the case for a general reconceptualization of disclosures, away from technical data dumps and instead towards interfaces. First, this is because a disclosure is an interface to an organization in that it provides a way to gain access to information about that organization's practices. Second, by considering a disclosure as an interface, it provides a practical framing for redesigning these disclosures using interface design principles. This allows disclosures to be designed around the needs, expectations, and requirements of their prospective recipients, leveraging decades of work on user-centered design. It is important to note, however, that this reconceptualization is about more than just aesthetics. The goal here is not simply prettier disclosures, but rather disclosures that better support people in being more informed over organizations and their practices. To explore the potential of disclosure interfaces and what this reconceptualization might actually mean in practice, we're first going to illustrate how a disclosure interface might be designed before then conducting a user study on that interface. To create the interface, we use document engineering, though there are many other approaches for interface design that could also be used. Document engineering is a methodology which works to streamline and automate document exchange within and across organizations. Within document engineering, documents are framed as the inputs and outputs of business processes, and by taking steps to improve these documents, we can streamline how information is exchanged between stakeholders. It was originally used to deconstruct user-facing documents, such as receipts and invoices, before reconstructing them into technical schemas for databases, for example. However, we looked to see how the methodology might be reappropriated. We instead looked to deconstruct the technical schemas that make up current disclosures and looked to reconstruct user-facing documents during the process. Fundamentally, disclosures are documents, and this methodology therefore offers an approach for specifying, designing, and deploying information disclosures that focus on informing the recipient. So document engineering is one potential methodology that might facilitate improved disclosure practices. We first started collecting a sample of information disclosures across a range of tech sectors to see how disclosures are being used today. We used a variety of apps and services to generate some test data, ranging from fitness trackers, music streaming platforms, advertising networks, and so on. We then exercised our right of access through the GDPR, requesting our data from 20 organizations. These organizations were not intended to be exhaustive, but rather they represented a typical sample of prominent organizations and how they were responding to data rights requests. And what we found was fairly consistent with the literature. Again, these examples were from fitness tracker applications and are highly technical and fragmented. For example, the GPS information is shown to the recipients in a series of latitude and longitude coordinates, rather than in a more visual format. In addition, there are a number of unintuitive types of information, such as sport type ID 1. Arguably, these disclosures aren't particularly effective in meaningfully communicating the organization's data processing practices. I'll now briefly cover each of the 6 steps of document engineering, but further details can be found within the paper. The first 3 steps involve the deconstruction of documents, in this case, our obtained disclosures. The first step involves identifying user requirements that our final disclosure should meet as a means for grounding the process. The second step involves uncovering patterns and trends in the types of information contained within the disclosures. For example, we noticed that many of the disclosures had information about the user, about their activities, about advertising information, usage logs, purchase records, and so on. Each of these categories gives some insight into the types of information that might be disclosed. We then analyze the disclosures that we've gathered in more detail and start to construct an understanding of the types of information that the different categories should contain and how these categories relate to each other. The last 3 steps of document engineering then look to reconstruct our disclosures in a more appropriate way. The 4th step in the process begins by assembling components of the disclosure. In the example here, we have activity data for a particular exercise. We combined information that was relevant to each exercise session, presented the geographical information visually, for example, and tried to create constructs that were user-facing as opposed to machine-readable files. But keep in mind, there are a range of different HCI and design approaches that could be implemented here in the process, such as participatory design, iterative prototyping, and so on. The 5th step involves combining these individual components into a document model that gives us an understanding of what our engineered disclosure should look like. And finally, the last stage of document engineering involves implementing and deploying the new disclosure interface. So document engineering is just one methodology that could be used to create disclosure interfaces. We now explore the utility of such disclosure interfaces through a user study involving 123 Mechanical Turk users. Our user study involved contrasting 2 versions of a disclosure to these participants: our engineered interface, shown on the right, versus examples representing current practice on the left. We stress here that our aim was not to argue that this is how disclosures should look. Rather, by contrasting our interface to that of current practice, the purpose was to evaluate the potential for disclosure interfaces and to demonstrate that better disclosures are possible. Each participant was asked a number of questions about the information contained within one of the disclosures, shown in a random order, before the process was repeated with the opposing disclosure. This has allowed us to evaluate their ability to interpret and interrogate both versions of the disclosure. Again, more information about the method, participants, and controls put in place are in the paper. Looking at the results, we found that participants appeared more able to meaningfully interrogate the information that was contained within the engineered disclosure. Participants were able to answer more questions about the data and were more confident in their answers when looking at the disclosure interface as opposed to the control disclosure representing current practice. In other words, the engineered interface appeared to better support the aims of a disclosure, to inform the recipient, and to provide comprehensible information. We also found that participants found the disclosure interface more usable, giving it a higher average score than the control interface through the System Usability Scale, or SUS. The SUS is a survey that gives a score for the usability of the system based on aspects such as ease of use, complexity, and consistency. The disclosure interface received a median SUS score of 87.5 out of 100. In contrast, the control disclosure had a median score of 25. Regardless of which interface people saw first, or whether they considered themselves technical or non-technical, the results were the same. The engineered interface had statistically higher SUS scores in every comparison we ran. In other words, our disclosure interface appeared to better cater for the needs and requirements of the participants. And third, when directly asked, participants just overwhelmingly preferred the disclosure interface to that of the control. In all, these results support our argument that disclosures can be better, and that disclosure interfaces appear to better support meaningful interrogation of the data in a more usable form, and are preferred more frequently to that of current practice. This is important. The control disclosure reflects current practices. And so our study therefore acts as a clear demonstration that better disclosures are not only possible, but sorely needed. Throughout this work, we've explored how we might reconceptualize disclosures away from highly technical data dumps and instead look to interface as a means for making the practices of data-driven organizations more meaningfully transparent. We'll now conclude with a few considerations. For one, we reiterate that this reconceptualization towards disclosures as interfaces is about more than just aesthetics. A prettier interface doesn't necessarily translate to more effective information disclosure, and disclosures should first and foremost meet their primary aim of informing the recipient. It was for this reason that we explored participants' abilities to meaningfully interrogate the information contained within the disclosure, in addition to their design preferences. Related to this is that disclosure interfaces should not act to whitewash or otherwise distract from questionable practices. There's a risk that the design of disclosures could steer users away from crucial information to support the organization's interests, similar to what we've seen with so-called dark patterns. It is for this reason that we argue that disclosure interfaces should support, rather than replace, more technical and detailed forms of information disclosure. Having the interface in addendum to the more technical information could support the aims and ambitions of a broader range of recipients. It would also allow verification of whether these interfaces fairly represent the information contained within the technical disclosure, ensuring that these interfaces remain an effective way to gain transparency over the organization's practices. Another point is that there are many drivers that could help bring about disclosure interfaces in practice. There are increasing regulatory pressures for organizations to become more transparent, and transparency regimes are playing an increasingly prominent role in emerging regulations. This also means that there is much scope for regulators to take a more active role in encouraging and shaping disclosure practices to something more useful. Industry bodies and trade associations could also drive towards improved disclosure mechanisms for their members. Similarly, civil society groups, researchers, and individuals can apply pressure on data-driven organizations by demanding disclosures which better align with their missions and concerns. And finally, while we've focused on disclosures for data protection, our central argument is much broader. Disclosure obligations exist in a variety of domains, including health, finance, and consumer protection. Not only does this mean that the design of disclosures is of broad significance, but there are a number of promising opportunities for research which seeks to understand how information disclosures can be more effectively designed. In all, reconceptualizing disclosures as interfaces to organizational data and practices shows much promise in bringing about disclosures that are more in line with their primary aim, informing the recipient. As our world becomes increasingly tech and data-driven, better disclosures will play an increasingly important role in supporting the holding of organizations to account.